Picture this, it's 1650 in Colonial, Virginia. A man has been murdered in broad daylight. There are no detectives to investigate, no forensic teams to collect evidence, no police officers to make an arrest. Instead, a single individual, part tax collector, part jailer, part executioner, rides out alone to bring the killer to justice. This was the reality of law enforcement in early America, and that solitary figure was the sheriff. Long before modern police departments, SWAT teams, or the FBI, the sheriff was often the only lawman for hundreds of miles. He was judge, jury, and sometimes executioner rolled into one. He collected taxes, served court orders, ran the jail, and pursued criminals across untamed wilderness. The office of the sheriff is the oldest law enforcement position in America, brought over from medieval England and adapted to the brutal realities of colonial life. Today, we're diving deep into the origins of the American sheriff, a role that shaped justice, power, and survival in the New World. This is the story of America's first lawmen, the men who stood alone between order and chaos. Historical context and background. To understand the American sheriff, we must first travel back to medieval England, where the office originated over 1,000 years ago. The term sheriff comes from shire reeve, the reeve or administrator of a shire, which was a territorial division similar to a county. In Anglo-Saxon England, the shire reeve was appointed by the king to enforce royal decrees, collect taxes, maintain order, and represent the crown's authority at the local level. By the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, the sheriff had become one of the most powerful figures in English local government, wielding both administrative and judicial power. When English colonists arrived in the New World in the early 1600s, they brought this legal tradition with them. The first American sheriff was appointed in Virginia in 1634, just 27 years after the founding of Jamestown. Virginia established 8 shires, later called counties, and each was assigned a sheriff to serve as the chief law enforcement officer. This model quickly spread to other colonies. By the late 1600s, sheriffs had been established throughout the English colonies, from Massachusetts to the Carolinas. But the role of the colonial sheriff was far more demanding and dangerous than his English counterpart. Colonial America was a vast, sparsely populated frontier. Roads were poor or non-existent. Communication was slow. Courts met infrequently, sometimes only once or twice a year. In this environment, the sheriff wasn't just an administrator. He was often the only representative of legal authority for miles around. The sheriff's duties were staggering in their scope. He collected taxes and fees on behalf of the colonial government, a task that was both essential and deeply unpopular. He served writs, summonses, and warrants issued by the courts. He maintained the county jail and was responsible for the care, and sometimes the execution, of prisoners. He assembled posses to pursue criminals. He conducted public auctions of seized property. In many colonies, he was also responsible for organizing the local militia and maintaining public order during emergencies. Unlike modern law enforcement, the sheriff was not a salaried employee. Instead, he was paid through a fee system. He received compensation for each task he performed, serving a warrant, transporting a prisoner, conducting an auction. This system created perverse incentives. A sheriff could maximize his income by seizing property, making arrests, and dragging out legal proceedings. Corruption was rampant. Some sheriffs became wealthy through their office, while others struggled to make ends meet in poor or remote counties. The sheriff was typically appointed by the colonial governor or elected by the county's freeholders, white male property owners. This meant that sheriffs were almost always drawn from the colonial elite, wealthy landowners, merchants, or military officers. They were expected to be literate, respected, and capable of exercising authority. But education in law enforcement tactics or criminal investigation was non-existent. Sheriffs learned on the job, relying on common sense, local custom, and brute force. The office was prestigious but perilous. Sheriffs faced constant danger from criminals, hostile Native American tribes, wild animals, and the harsh elements of frontier life. Many sheriffs were killed in the line of duty, ambushed while serving warrants or pursuing fugitives. Others were sued, assaulted, or publicly humiliated by angry citizens who resented their authority. It was a role that demanded courage, cunning, and an iron will. By the time of the American Revolution, the sheriff had become a fixture of colonial society, a symbol of both authority and controversy. As the colonies moved toward independence, the sheriff would play a crucial role in the struggle between local autonomy and centralized power, a tension that continues to define the office to this day. Case study/real-life examples. Sheriff William Stone of Maryland, power and betrayal in the 1650s. One of the most dramatic examples of a colonial sheriff's authority and its limits can be found in the story of William Stone, who served as both governor and sheriff of Maryland in the 1650s. Stone was a Protestant appointed by the Catholic Lord Baltimore to govern the colony, a decision meant to ease religious tensions. But Maryland was a powder keg of sectarian conflict, and Stone found himself caught between competing factions. In 1654, Puritan settlers, backed by the Commonwealth government in England, seized control of Maryland and ousted Stone from power. Stone attempted to retake the colony by force, leading a small militia in what became known as the Battle of the Severn in March 1655. The battle was a disaster. Stone's forces were defeated, and he was captured along with several of his officers. As the former sheriff and governor, Stone had once wielded absolute authority over the colony's legal system. Now he stood trial before his enemies, accused of treason and insurrection. 4 of his officers were executed on the spot, their bodies left as warnings. Stone himself was sentenced to death, but the sentence was commuted after intervention from England. He was stripped of his offices and lived out his remaining years in obscurity. Stone's story illustrates the precarious nature of power in colonial America. The sheriff was the embodiment of legal authority, but that authority was only as strong as the political and military forces that backed it. In a time of upheaval, even the most powerful lawman could find himself on trial or facing execution. Sheriff Jonathan Corwin of Salem, Justice and Witchcraft in 1692. Perhaps no colonial sheriff is more infamous than Jonathan Corwin of Salem, Massachusetts, who served during the Salem witch trials of 1692. Corwin was not just the sheriff. He was also one of the magistrates who presided over the trials, making him both investigator and judge in one of the darkest chapters of American history. When accusations of witchcraft began to spread through Salem village in early 1692, it was Sheriff George Corwin, Jonathan's nephew, also serving as sheriff, who arrested the accused. The sheriff's role was critical. He served the warrants, transported prisoners to jail, and carried out the court's orders. As the hysteria escalated, the sheriff found himself arresting neighbors, friends, and even prominent citizens on charges of consorting with the devil. The trials were a mockery of justice. Evidence consisted of spectral visions, hearsay, and the testimony of terrified children. The accused had no right to legal representation. Confessions were coerced through threats and torture, and once convicted, it was the sheriff who carried out the executions. Between June and September 1692, Sheriff George Corwin oversaw the hanging of 19 people on Gallows Hill. He also supervised the pressing death of Giles Corey, an elderly farmer who refused to enter a plea and was slowly crushed under heavy stones, a brutal method designed to force compliance. Corwin carried out these executions with bureaucratic efficiency, recording each death in the official records. But Corwin was not just an executioner. He was also an opportunist. Under colonial law, the property of convicted witches could be seized by the government. Corwin aggressively confiscated the estates of the condemned, enriching himself in the process. When the witch trials finally ended and public opinion turned against the prosecutions, Corwin faced lawsuits and public condemnation. He died in 1696, still holding the office of sheriff, but his legacy was forever tainted. The Salem witch trials demonstrate how the sheriff's power could be weaponized in times of moral panic. With no checks on his authority and no oversight beyond the local magistrates, the sheriff became an instrument of persecution, enforcing laws that were unjust and prosecutions that were fraudulent. Sheriff John Sevier of the Tennessee frontier, lawman and warrior. On the western frontier, sheriffs faced a different set of challenges. John Sevier, who served as sheriff in what is now Tennessee in the 1770s and 1780s, was as much a military commander as a lawman. The frontier was a violent, lawless place, where settlers faced constant threats from outlaws, land disputes, and Native American raids. The sheriff had to be tough, resourceful, and willing to fight. Sevier was a legendary frontiersman, known for his leadership in the Battle of Kings Mountain during the Revolutionary War. As sheriff, he organized posses to pursue horse thieves and bandits, often leading armed expeditions into dangerous territory. He mediated land disputes, which were a constant source of conflict on the frontier, where property lines were poorly defined and competing claims were common. But Sevier's most significant role was as a leader in the frontier's violent conflicts with Native American tribes. In the 1780s, as settlers pushed westward into Cherokee and Creek territory, clashes became frequent and brutal. Sevier led multiple military campaigns against Native American villages, campaigns that often blurred the line between law enforcement and warfare. In his mind, and in the minds of many settlers, he was protecting his community. To the Native Americans, he was an invader and a war criminal. Sevier's career illustrates the dual nature of the frontier sheriff, part lawman, part warlord. In the absence of federal or state authority, sheriffs like Sevier wielded enormous power, shaping the future of entire regions through their decisions about justice, property, and violence. Sheriff Augustine Prevost of Georgia, the Loyalist lawman. Not all colonial sheriffs supported the American Revolution. Augustine Prevost, a Swiss-born officer who served as sheriff in Georgia during the 1770s, remained loyal to the British crown. When war broke out, Prevost used his position to suppress rebel activity, arresting patriots, seizing property, and enforcing British military law. Prevost's tenure as sheriff was marked by brutal reprisals. He organized loyalist militias to raid rebel farms, burning homes and confiscating supplies. He imprisoned suspected patriots without trial, relying on his authority as sheriff to justify his actions. For Georgia's revolutionaries, Prevost became a symbol of tyranny, a lawman who had betrayed his community in service to a foreign king. After the British defeat, Prevost fled to East Florida, and his property was confiscated by the new American government. His story is a reminder that the sheriff's authority was always political, shaped by the conflicts and loyalties of the time. In the Revolutionary era, being a sheriff meant choosing sides, and the wrong choice could cost you everything. Social impact and analysis. The colonial sheriff was more than just a law enforcement officer. He was a symbol of authority, a mediator of disputes, and a repository of local power. But his role also exposed deep tensions in colonial society, tensions between rich and poor, between settlers and Native Americans, between centralized authority and local autonomy. One of the most significant impacts of the sheriff system was its reinforcement of social hierarchies. Sheriffs were almost always drawn from the wealthy, landowning class. They enforced laws that protected property rights, collected taxes that funded the colonial elite, and served court orders that disproportionately targeted the poor. In Virginia, for example, sheriffs were responsible for enforcing tobacco taxes and debt collections, tasks that often led to the seizure of small farmers' land and property. This created widespread resentment, contributing to uprisings like Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, where poor settlers rose up against the colonial government and its sheriffs. The fee-based compensation system also fostered corruption. Sheriffs had a financial incentive to maximize arrests, seizures, and auctions, which meant they often targeted those least able to defend themselves. Complaints about sheriff misconduct were common, but accountability was rare. In most colonies, sheriffs were appointed by the governor or elected by a narrow electorate of wealthy landowners, meaning they answered to the elite rather than the broader community. The sheriff's role in enforcing racial and social hierarchies cannot be ignored. In the southern colonies, sheriffs were responsible for enforcing slave codes, capturing runaway slaves, and suppressing any signs of resistance. They worked closely with slave patrols, and in many cases, the sheriff himself organized and led these patrols. The sheriff's authority was thus integral to the maintenance of slavery, making him a key figure in the institutionalization of racial oppression. At the same time, the sheriff provided a crucial service in a society that lacked alternative mechanisms for dispute resolution and crime prevention. In the absence of professional police, the sheriff was the person you turned to when your property was stolen, when violence erupted, or when a contract was violated. He represented the possibility of justice, however flawed, in a world where might often made right. Modern connections reflection. The office of the sheriff has survived for over 380 years in America, making it one of the oldest and most enduring law enforcement institutions in the country. Today, there are more than 3,000 sheriffs serving in counties across the United States, each one elected by local voters. But the role has evolved dramatically since the colonial era. Modern sheriffs still perform many of the same functions as their colonial predecessors. They run county jails, serve court papers, conduct property auctions, and provide law enforcement in unincorporated areas. But they now operate within a complex legal framework, constrained by constitutional protections, state and federal laws, and professional standards. The days of the sheriff as a quasi-autonomous local strongman are largely gone, though not entirely. In recent years, the office of the sheriff has become a flashpoint in debates over law enforcement accountability and local versus federal authority. Some sheriffs have positioned themselves as defenders of local rights against what they see as federal overreach, refusing to enforce certain gun control laws or immigration policies. This harkens back to the colonial era, when sheriffs were seen as representatives of local autonomy against distant centralized power. At the same time, sheriffs have faced criticism for lack of accountability. Unlike police chiefs, who are typically appointed and can be removed by mayors or city councils, sheriffs are elected and can only be removed through recall elections or criminal prosecution. This makes them uniquely independent and uniquely difficult to hold accountable when they abuse their power. The legacy of the colonial sheriff, particularly his role in enforcing slavery and racial hierarchies, also continues to shape modern debates. In many southern states, sheriffs were instrumental in enforcing Jim Crow laws, resisting desegregation, and suppressing the civil rights movement. This history has led some reformers to question whether the office of sheriff, with its roots in medieval England and colonial oppression, is compatible with modern democratic values. Yet the sheriff remains deeply popular in many communities, seen as a more accountable and locally responsive alternative to state or federal law enforcement. The tension between tradition and reform, between local autonomy and oversight, between the romantic myth of the frontier lawman and the reality of systemic abuse. These are the same tensions that define the office in colonial America. From the muddy streets of Jamestown to the blood-soaked gallows of Salem, from the untamed Tennessee frontier to the contested loyalties of the Revolutionary War, the colonial sheriff was the embodiment of law and order in early America. He was tax collector and executioner, mediator and warrior, protector and oppressor. He stood alone in a vast, dangerous land wielding power that was at once necessary and easily abused. The office of the sheriff shaped the development of American law enforcement, establishing patterns of local control, fee-based incentives, and social hierarchy that persist to this day. It also exposed fundamental questions about authority, accountability, and justice, questions that remain unresolved centuries later. As we reflect on the legacy of America's first lawmen, we must ask ourselves, what do we want from our law enforcement? How do we balance the need for local autonomy with the demand for accountability? How do we reckon with the troubling history of an office that was instrumental in enforcing slavery, suppressing dissent, and concentrating power in the hands of the elite? The sheriff is the oldest law enforcement position in America, but that doesn't mean it's immune to change. History shows us both the value and the danger of investing so much authority in a single individual. The challenge for modern America is to preserve what works: local accountability, community connection, democratic election, while reforming what doesn't: unchecked power, systemic bias, and resistance to oversight. What do you think? Is the office of the sheriff a vital part of American democracy or an outdated relic of colonial times? Should sheriffs have more power or less? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the history of America's first lawmen, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more historical explorations. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.